2 seconds. On May 11th, 2023, the Arctic Council assembled to witness Russia hand the chairmanship to Norway, which Brett 23 of Foreign Policy concludes was a peaceful transfer. If Russia wanted to derail the process, Brett concludes that it easily could have, but Russia cooperated. This isn't the only recent example of increasing de-escalation in the Arctic. Wall 23 writes that U.S. presence in the Arctic is cautious, avoiding military deployment escalation while focusing on domain awareness, research, and cooperation. As a result, Putin has de-escalated the region, as Goslin 23 writes that Russia has pulled its resources from its bases and has slowed down production of technology. Unfortunately, affirming risks progress, as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs finds that U.S. policy in the Arctic has historically followed a pattern of calculated aggression fueled by capitalistic warhawks. Thus, Milan and I are proud to negate. Our first contention is conflict. Affirming would trigger a massive shift in Russian risk calculus, as Ritter 20 writes, because most of Russia's nukes are stored in the Arctic, increased military presence would lead Russia to perceive a U.S. first strike on their nuclear capabilities, skyrocketing the potential for conflict. Thus, Rumor 21 corroborates that while Russia's goals in the Arctic are currently defensive, U.S. buildup in the region would uniquely heighten Russian threat perception, shifting Russia to an offense-oriented posture. Further, increased U.S. presence would also embolden our allies, as Higher 18 explains that in the Arctic, more U.S. presence would signal to Russia that Norwegian and U.S. security are inseparable, while also making Norwegian forces more inclined to pursue combat closer to Russia's border. Deterrence is favored before restraint, which means that episodes are likely to escalate and lead to a crisis with Russia before a U.S. tripwire activates, giving Norwegian forces an incentive to create conflict so intense allies get involved. However, increased military presence would come too late to deter the Russian threat, as Schultz 19 explains that the U.S. is not able to increase surface vessel presence in the Arctic until at least 2025, since icebreakers are not yet funded or scheduled to be commissioned. Thus, affirming the resolution means creating conflict that the U.S. cannot win, while also diminishing any future cooperation that can occur in the area. Wicker 22 finds that our adversaries' icebreaker fleets outpace ours by more than 25 to 1. Problematically, Claire 20 reasons the Arctic is a flashpoint that risks nuclear escalation because Russia has concentrated its nuclear second strike and therefore deterrent capability there. Threats of militarization promote a use it or lose it mentality, creating a war in which Star 14 finds would create ice age conditions where no crops can be grown, causing extinction. Even absent nuclear use, Payne 16 quantifies that a conventional war between the US and Russia would kill 80 million people. Our second contention is indigenous communities. U.S. security policy empirically fails to address questions of local level existential threats, which is why Grishia 22 writes that Arctic security policy is deeply rooted in a colonial legacy. The act would exacerbate this threat in two ways. First is land. Silva 22 writes that Arctic militarization represents a new wave of colonialism, projecting settler colonial ideas of security and capitalism over the Inuit homeland. Empirically, Bogano 1 writes that U.S. missile deployment in the Arctic displaced Inuit communities, a battle against the world's most powerful institution that the smallest, most remote population on Earth had no chance of winning. Land is the lifeblood of indigenous living, as Larned 18 writes that land connects the Inuit to their traditions and ancestors. It is a legacy to be preserved for the seventh generation, not a commodity to be bought and sold in the name of security. Second is food. Empirically, the U.S. military has caused widespread contamination in the Arctic. Miller 22 details that highly toxic chemicals have accumulated in the bodies of seals, whales, and other fish, contaminating crucial food sources of indigenous peoples. Miller furthers that 100% of the fish by Arctic military sites were contaminated with cancerous levels of toxic chemicals. Indeed, Marlot 22 finds that as permafrost melts, military bases will continue to sink and leach waste and oil into surrounding communities. Increased military presence would be the nail in the coffin for indigenous survival, as Vogue 21 finds that Arctic indigenous peoples already face high levels of food insecurity. Thus, preserve the Arctic peace, negate.
Okay, is everyone ready for the AF case?
Yeah.
Time starts now. We affirm contention 1 is Greenland. Military expansion is key to relations. Broom 21 finds U.S. military activity is of immense interest to Greenland. The ways the U.S. pursues strategic interests will impact relations. Technical experts from the U.S. have been to Greenland to assess civilian airports and a deep water port. U.S. satellites have been collecting data from about every inch of Greenland not covered by ice. Military upgrades would mean the U.S. was investing precisely as they've written in their strategies. It would fit perfectly into the pattern already drawn by the U.S. in northern Norway and Alaska. America needs strategic minerals in Greenland subsoil. Relations are key to climate efforts. Scholar 21 explains the world must pivot quickly to renewable energy. However, the prerequisite is rare earth elements key to the production of wind and solar. Currently, most REE production is in China. It gives China the ability to dictate the pace of renewable transition. If the US wants a rapid global transition, it must acquire an REE resource, with Greenland the obvious choice. If Biden finds a way to appease Greenland, the way is paved for a masterstroke to assume the high ground on climate change. Absent action, Spectre 19 finds by 2050, the world's ice sheets vanish, brutal droughts kill the Amazon, and the planet plunges into a feedback loop of ever hotter, deadlier conditions. Armed conflicts over resources culminating in nuclear war are likely. The result is the end of human civilization. Contention 2 is a broken system. Cameron 21 finds Washington has fallen behind in its Arctic presence and capability. It has not taken advantage of the Arctic for trade route exploitation. The US will likely lose portions of the Arctic by 2050. That's why Brodko 21 finds attempts to impede US access to the Arctic must be deterred. Washington must invest in US Coast Guard capabilities. Greenhall 21 finds the US Coast Guard, a DHS component, and the only US armed force to reside outside of the DoD, features prominently in the DHS strategy. This Coast Guard focus is good for reason, as the service has provided security and safety presence in the Arctic for over 150 years. Greenhall 21 confirms, as more DHS components establish larger Arctic footprints, the DHS acknowledges the Coast Guard in that there's little direction in the strategy that does not include Coast Guard leadership or participation. Indeed, Gimas 23 explains, as the sole operator of the USS Polar icebreaker fleet, the US Coast Guard has immense responsibility in the Arctic. Establishing presence in the Arctic is key, as Becker's 15 projects overall trade reductions from the Arctic Sea route will increase the trade flows by around 10%. This lifts millions out of poverty, as Levy 19 quantifies every 1 percentage point increase in trade is associated with a 0.15% decline in poverty. World Vision quantifies 1.2 billion people in developing countries are multidimensionally poor. Contention 3 is indigenous communities. The Arctic is disrupting, as Menace 19 finds. Arctic outmigration is due to lack of employment, remoteness, lack of education, and health services. Arigata 19 says only 52% of Inuit aged 15 or older living in Nunavut were unemployed. Unfortunately, Hio and Yi 19 explains, US military deployment has a positive effect on host countries' domestic and FDI. Deployment will improve security, which will provide an investment-friendly environment. As a result, each additional 100 US troops deployed leads to a $21 million increase in investment. DHS 22 says that Tribal Homeland Security Advisory Council will provide advice and recommendations to the Secretary through engagement with DHS agencies. The critical importance of how DHS engages tribal nations means the Council will be collaborating on all matters of Homeland Security as they relate to tribal nations. Indeed, Devlin 22 finds establishing contractual relationships with local indigenous populations will become the central priority to operating in the Arctic, as they represent the original warriors in the northern polar region. Indigenous populations can assist the military as trainers, interpreters, guides, guards, and subject matter experts in numerous areas. That's key, as Tintin 12 contextualizes a 10% increase in per capita FDI increases per capita GDP by 3.9%. Investment stops cyclical poverty. The OACAS states lack of investment in on-reserve services perpetuates poverty among indigenous communities. This is crucial, as the UN finds indigenous people account for almost 19% of the extreme poor, and Peer 23 contextualizes 719 million people live in extreme poverty. Thus, we affirm.
So the next part of the round is where the two debaters who just spoke are going to ask each other questions, either about their cases or anything else they want to talk about.
Okay, let me just get a timer. Okay, can I get first question?
Yeah.
What is poverty like in Okinawa and Red Hill and places where the US has military bases?
If you want to tell me a point, you can go for it.
I mean, it's awful. Like in Okinawa, there is some of the highest poverty rates in Japan, and that's an overseas base, which is specifically what your evidence about FBI is talking about. In Red Hill, the surrounding communities have been polluted, and their land values have significantly gone down due to years and years of pollution from US military sources. So the point I'm making here is that there's no reason why FBI is the thing that ultimately breaks intergenerational cycles of poverty.
All right, couple things. One, pollution is a completely different point. We'll contest that even first of all, there's a lot of factors to that, but second, in the Arctic specifically, it's probably non-unique. And we'd say reinvestment would adapt to those climate conditions. But second of all, our evidence is just general domestic investment. And I think also in the Arctic specifically, because they're already in these conditions, there's at least like a risk of solvency. Can I have a
Wait,
question?
pause. So the argument is about domestic investment. Then why is all of your evidence about FDI?
It's both domestic and FDI.
But that's
Like
not what
that's
your
what the
evidence says.
Keogh evidence says.
The Keogh evidence says FDI.
No, the Keogh evidence says a positive effect on host countries' domestic and foreign direct investment.
Yeah, host country. Host country meaning a country that is not the U.S. that is hosting U.S. troops.
Yeah, and
such
the
as
investment
Japan,
from
Korea,
that
Taiwan.
and going into that country. Like that's what host domestic means. Like the evidence does say domestic. It's like in the card.
Wait, so is your indigenous peoples argument talking about indigenous peoples in the US or indigenous peoples in other Arctic countries?
Both.
So then what does the DHS have to do with indigenous people in other countries?
Wait, okay. One, the DHS is like the one contributing to a lot of the it's facilitating the investment channels in the first place and also doing the consultation.
Yeah, but definitionally,
we've been on this
DHS
for like 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah, you can get a question.
Okay. On your indigenous argument, are your links specific to the US military or just general militarization?
No, they're specific to the US military.
Why?
Because our evidence is all specific to the US military.
Yeah, what your evidence is talking about generally bad things about military. For example, like toxic chemicals coming from like equipment or like land loss coming from usage of like bases. So if any other country militarizes the Arctic, why are the impacts not going to happen?
Well, obviously, militarization on U.S. soil is unique to the U.S. military, right? Like Russia's not going to.
Wait, okay, so your impact only accesses U.S. soil in like the Arctic. Like we're only going to impact that one area uniquely.
Yeah, sure, but if we make an argument about an arms race, like U.S. presence triggers buildup in other countries too, obviously there's a link in, but there's no reason why our argument being purely domestic is a reason why it's weak. Like domestic problems matter too.
Well, sure, but like the way you're phrasing your argument just makes it seem like it's like only the U.S. that would cause a problem. Okay.
Yeah, we're saying
like 5 seconds
left.
left. Do you want a question?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Next is rebuttal, where the negation side, because they're going first, will respond to everything said in the affirmation case.
Okay, Irene, can you mute? Oh, wait, okay, it's fine. Is everyone good? Time starts now. On their first contention, the incentive to mine always exists because both Greenland and the US have a vested interest in A, preventing climate change, and B, stopping the Chinese monopoly. There's second, zero warrant for why military interests would make Greenland let the US mine. US foreign investment exists literally everywhere in the world, even absent increased military presence. Third, their own evidence says that Greenlanders aren't worried about security threats. They're worried about the pollution impacts of mining. At that point, military pollution from the app serves as a further incentive, as you're only going to have less mining in the app.
You can see right away. The reason I had you move it right away is you can see that it comes down into the right alignment. Right?
Yeah.
So make this for me.
So
Yeah.
if it, I mean, what does it do?
Sorry. All right. Yeah. Fourth, Greenland is irrelevant. Takaya writes, Japan recently discovered a deposit of REMs that could provide for the entire world for a semi-infinite period of time, and the US will import from them. Fifth, Walkie23 writes that we're already beginning to mine a massive deposit in Wyoming. This solvency is faster because new mines take 5 to 10 years to actually get the permits for or the investment for in Greenland, whereas in Wyoming, it's happening already. Sixth, climate change isn't as essential. Mutually assured destruction averts a nuclear war, and while we may lose the Amazon and the ice sheets, Osaka 20 explains that most of the Earth will always be inhabitable thanks to human genius and adaptation. Seventh, resource wars are happening now. Hennigan 15 explains population growth combined with the worldwide decline in spending on agricultural research guarantees a food crisis by 2030, which will spark World War III over increasingly scarce food supply. Carbon emissions solve, as Bell 16 explains that carbon dioxide promotes the greening effect, which Top 13 finds increases photosynthetic rates of food crops up to 40%, feeding millions. Go to their second contention. First, we're not losing the Arctic. Their own evidence says we'll only lose parts of the Arctic, which makes sense because there's viable trade routes like the Northwest Passage within the US and Canada's exclusive economic zone. Our Wall 23 evidence indicates that we're slowing building up domain awareness to prevent Russian and Chinese encroachment. Second, since their own evidence indicates that the impact doesn't trigger until 2050, this is a reason to vote neg. Simon 23 writes that as permafrost melts, there's no way to build stable infrastructure that lasts in the long term. It's better to wait until 10 to 20 years down the line to build, because Marla 20 writes that military spending now would trade off with more critical permafrost research efforts that enable a long-term presence. Third, their only warrant for the Coast Guard being key is icebreakers. Don't let them read a new warrant. At that point, the status quo is enough to solve, Mizukami 21 writes, we have 6 icebreakers commissioned already. Finally, on the impact, Donnelly writes, globalization has failed to increase economic and GDP rates in many countries while only giving incentives to abuse workers return a large profit. As Berger furthers, that increased trade benefits those who already have skills or own factories, which is why Thurrock finds that globalization has increased poverty significantly in Africa. Prefer this over their generalized impact evidence, because theirs takes data mostly from China and India, who saw their economic gains primarily due to political changes. Finally, they have no link into poverty reduction. Their evidence about trade is specific to Northeast Asia and Northwest Europe, which are two of the richest regions in the world. On the third contention, first, you don't need the military. Their own Menezes evidence names 2 other initiatives solving out migration right now. First, hospitals are making better telemedicine services to foster rural entrepreneurship. And second, Scottish universities are joining the Arctic-wide university network to bolster health training. Their own evidence concedes that civil investments into education, entrepreneurships, and a better safety net are solving the status quo. Second, their only link for military deployments into improved economies is FDI. Their HAO study talking about host countries receiving more foreign direct investment is literally about every region except the Arctic, and it's talking about post-Cold War US military presence. The reasons why US deployments lead to high FDI after the Cold War don't apply here. It's not like Afghanistan or Niger, where markets are really volatile because of constant regime change or terrorism that only the military solves. Third, don't let them pretend like military values indigenous life. 100% of their link is about the Department of Homeland Security, which does TSA at the airport and anti-terror measures. They're explicitly not associated with increased military presence. Fourth, the Department of Homeland Security is a civilian agency. It's not the DoD, which is the military. Then they're going to say, they might say the DHS refers to the Coast Guard, but none of their devilish evidence literally never mentions the Coast Guard once. That means even if some greater DHS cooperation would be better, it's already happening, so you don't need to affirm, and it's not topical because it's non-military DHS cooperation. The contractual relationships they talk about literally just commodify indigenous people's relationships with the land to serve US commercial and security interests. They take away their ancestral land and food sources and give them jobs so they can buy expensive processed food. That's solving for a problem they're creating in the first place. Yeah.
Sorry, flex prep. What was the last response? Just the very last one.
It's in the chat.
Okay. Aaron and I are
We'll take prep, yeah.
yeah. I'll hold up the
Okay.
phone. We start. Starting now.
After Connor and Aaron finish prep time, then the affirmation will be responding to both what Milan said in his last speech and then also Irene's case. So all the parts of the arguments.
Okay, that was 1 minute 10. So I'm going to start by defending my case, and then I'm going to move on to addressing the opponent's case. Let me just mute the call real quick. Okay. Is everyone good? Time starts now. We'll concede the defense on Greenland. There's no impact off this. On contention 2, the only turn they have is that like spending trade off of permafrost. There's no impact for this, no contextualization. You're not evaluating it. On C3, this is what we're going for. They give you 4 or 5 responses. The first thing they tell you is that our evidence says that hospitals solve and like education can also solve. But no, our evidence says that it's possible, not that these are happening. That's what we need to affirm because that's the only guaranteed risk of solvency. The second thing they tell you, or the second response we would give you is that climate change displaces them in either world. We'll get to this more on their case. But second, we tell you that they say that the FDI only happens in other countries. There's no warrant why this doesn't apply to the Arctic too. Our argument is that when you increase military presence in the Arctic, that creates more security and it becomes a more secure investment for investors around the world, both domestically and foreignly, which is why we see more investment on that. They don't do any actual warranting as to why this doesn't apply, even if it's just talking about the Middle East. But then they give you 2 more responses about how the Coast Guard, how our evidence is talking about the Department of Homeland Security. But remember the evidence that we read you in our C2, which tells you that the Coast Guard is a part of the Department of Homeland Security. It is a part of the DHS, but it's also the only part of the DHS to also be part of the military, which means that obviously it's topical and their argument just doesn't apply. The fifth thing they tell you is that we would take their land. We'll get to this on their case. It's just a cross application. That being said, go to their case. At the top, their Gosselin evidence contradicts what they say when you scroll down. The Gosselin 23 card actually says the Russian government kept announcing more resources for the Arctic in 2022, such as construction of more icebreakers and military subs, as well as calling for greater attention there in 2023. Their own evidence contradicts it. This is probably an independent reason for you to drop them because they're misrepresenting it. But second, this is proof that Russia is still developing things like oil drills and utilizing trade routes. So even if they aren't going militarily, we'd argue that they're still going to do things like use oil drills and they're still going to go there to get trade. Prefer our evidence from Alargar. It takes into account all factors of Ukraine and post-states. Alargar 2023 finds that Russia wants to make the Arctic its own, putting increased emphasis on the Arctic where they're stronger and less surrounded by NATO. Also, their warrant for drawdown is sanctions, but Russia's economy is growing right now. As Rep Report 23 explains that Russian output will expand 0.3% this year and 2.1%, defying earlier forecasts of contraction amid sanctions. This means that there's obviously no drawdown from sanctions. That's their only warrant. Don't give them access to new warranting and summary. On contention 1, they say Russia will escalate 4 responses. First, we argue Russia is too busy in Ukraine to start another conflict. They know they lose if they start a war. Second, Russia's dependence checks back. Burke 21 finds Russia seeks an aggressive look into Arctic to deter others and maintain access to resources. Russia's dependence on the Arctic for natural resources makes influence over the region imperative for future national growth and sustainment. Arctic conflict is the last thing Russia wants because war would degrade Russia's economic stability. This A proves that Russia is still going to the Arctic right now, and B proves that they wouldn't do military escalation. But third, the Coast Guard is a defensive force that has never actually triggered escalation because Russia knows small tactical boats aren't a threat compared to huge bombers and nuclear ships. Insofar as they have conceded that the most likely implementation of the resolution is the Coast Guard because they're the only ones who have a fleet in the first place to go to the Arctic, we'd argue that's going to be more defensive. But fourth, Russian incentive calculus contradicts that they care about nukes than retaliating to try and die, which means they'll avoid it. Also, their argument about mutually assured destruction, taking out nukes, literally takes our own contention now because it means that there's no impact of nuclear war. So they non-unique their own contention. But on Norway, 3 more responses. First, insofar as we're winning that the Coast Guard will be the type of military we use, we'd argue Norway will understand we're strictly using a defensive strategy, and Norway understands that. Second, there's no warrant as to why Norway pursues conflict. We'd argue not having U.S. military presence is what gives Norway the incentive to start a war in fear of them being overrun by Russia due to a lack of allied support. But third, we'd argue that the Arctic Council will check back and make sure Norway doesn't escalate. They say we don't have enough icebreakers. They literally say themselves that we commissioned 6 of them in their rebuttal speech. But second, this is an independent reason as to why our argument is true, and we would only do the Coast Guard because they are the only ones who have the 2 icebreakers. On cooperation, one response will never cooperate with Russia because it justifies their acting to Ukraine. That's why it's not happening right now. On contention 2, first, our Mendes and Ariata cards answer this whole contention. Indigenous people are being displaced right now, so you should be voting for the only side that has a risk of changing anything. And all of their links get triggered by other countries' military. Grishas is vague in talking about general Arctic policy. Prefer our Devlin card, which looks at the future of the US's approach and happens specifically when we substantially increase military presence. Furthermore, our argument is very simple. It tells you that the Devlin card tells you that the only way to have a successful military presence in the Arctic is by talking to the indigenous people because they are the only ones who know how to navigate the region. That's why we wouldn't do things that piss them off, like take their land and take their food. But then we would argue habitat loss displaces, as Hancock 23 explains, as warming causes climate change. We lose Arctic sea ice at 30% per decade. If unchecked, the Arctic could become ice-free by 2040. This means you should vote for the only risk of solvency. But on food, we go for 1 turn. I don't know where it went, but first, we'd argue that we wouldn't be building more bases. We'd just be using existing ones. And second, U.S. bases aren't built new places with a lot of people. Okay, you good for cross?
Irene, do you want to call for evidence before cross or after?
No, I'm not going to call for us.
Yeah, I'm good for cross.
Okay.
1 second.
First question.
Okay. Time starts now. What does your Devlin card say changes in the AF?
The Devlin card says that the only way to have substantial military presence is by working with the indigenous people because they're the ones who can act as guides and interpreters, etc.
Who has been working with indigenous people so far?
Nobody. Actually, that's not true. I take that back. The card we read right after in our case, let me find the name of it.
The DHS card?
Yeah, the DHS card tells you that right now the Tribal Homeland Security is collaborating with the DHS on our future engagement. The problem is that we just don't have troops right now.
Collaborating with what part of the DHS?
DHS in general.
All right. Is it at any point does it mention the Coast Guard?
No, but the Coast Guard's a part of the DHS.
Sure, but does it mention the Coast Guard in your evidence?
No, but insofar as
DHS,
what?
Are there parts of the DHS that aren't the Coast Guard?
Yeah, but then that can go to the Arctic. So if we're going to increase military presence, obviously it'd be the Coast Guard. It's not like we're going to send the TSA to the Arctic. I don't think.
Sure, no, from the TSA to the Arctic. Yeah, you can take a question.
Okay, so let's talk about your argument. I guess let's talk about indigenous people. So if they're being displaced right now, how do you guys solve that?
First of all, your own evidence that you say doesn't actually talk about current solvency measures. It talks about current solvency measures. So non-military cooperation and non-military investment is already happening. Investment from not just the United States, but from Scotland, Scottish universities. They're already instituting like huge telemedicine networks all across the Arctic.
Is that enough? Is that enough to solve? Because we both agree that right now because you read your own evidence from 2021, which postdates ours, which tells you that right now they still have the highest rates of food insecurity. So insofar as the current measures still put them at a very high level of food insecurity, that's pretty clear that right now our current strategies aren't good, right?
This talks about food insecurity being really high. The worst thing you can do to that is to make it worse. So at that point, you have like two links into why you make it worse in the AF, not just from our case, which is that, the military is really bad and use toxic chemicals, specifically from US bases in the past that, destroy fishing and wildlife there, but also because now in your world, suddenly you're diverting all investment that was going to actual civilian infrastructure and stuff like that to military bases, which are themselves harmful in the first place.
Wait, why would they invest into, how do you invest into a military base? That doesn't make much sense at all.
What?
How do investors invest into a military base?
You're talking about things like increased FDI, which only come in the military, but then all your evidence talks about how investments and things like collaboration with the DHS is important because it means that Indigenous people have jobs to buy foods and shipping routes to buy food from other places, which is just solving for a problem that you're creating because you're making it so that they can't actually access food in the first place because you're destroying their natural food sources. Does that make sense? Like at best for you, your whole food insecurity is not a turn at all.
Talk about this in the back half. You can take a question.
Sure. Let's talk about mutually assured destruction. Why? So if Russia sees a new U.S. military posturing, a new U.S. military buildup in the Arctic, specifically near the place where they keep their second strike capabilities, doesn't this make them worried about mutually assured destruction and their ability to actually,
First, we argue that the Coast Guard is obviously defensive, and that's the most likely implication of the resolution. And second, we tell you that Russia doesn't want to risk a conflict because they know they lose as their spreadsheet then in Ukraine.
Okay.
Wait, is that cross? All right, cool. We're gonna take prep starting now.
The next speech is going to be Neg's summary. So they're going to kind of go over everything that's been said and maybe pick one specific contention that they want to make like their big argument while responding to their opponent's responses.
Okay. Milan, can you mute? It's gonna go our case is their case. So into the next first. On our case, we're going for our argument about Indigenous peoples. The argument is simple. U.S. security policy has historically excluded Indigenous people, and we say that the app only accelerates this trend. Our link is about food. What we say is that when the U.S. military goes there, they pay no mind to the pollution they create. They emit oil, they emit chemical pollutants, which ultimately poison the fish and the seals, these food sources that Indigenous people rely on to sustain their traditions and sustain their life. Which is why our Miller evidence indicates that 100% of the fish around U.S. military bases end up being contaminated, which poses an existential threat to Indigenous communities' survival. They read 5 responses. First, they tell you that Indigenous peoples are being displaced right now, but Millen responds to this in rebuttal saying that A, their evidence is talking about rural people, not Indigenous people specifically, but second, it concedes that solvency is occurring now because hospitals and other investment is already pouring in that is developing the area that serves indigenous people. But second, they say that Argyrius evidence is really vague. No, it's not, specifically talking about US military presence in the Arctic in relation to indigenous people. Third, they say that the US military needs indigenous people to navigate. This is so false. We have radar systems. We have the most advanced tech in the world. We don't rely on indigenous people, especially when oftentimes our incentives collide with theirs. They want to keep their land. We want to take their land. And obviously our incentive overrides that, which gives us an incentive to develop tech to subvert the need for indigenous people in the first place, which is why historically, when we have to deploy missiles, all of our empirical evidence indicates that we take land from indigenous people and we poison their food. Fourth, they say the Arctic is going to be ice-free by 2040. There's zero contextualization on this. We say that either way, they're still going to have their land, they're still going to have food, even if the ice is melting a little faster. Fifth, they say that we're not going to build new bases. They don't get the fiat that it's only the Coast Guard. Sure, they win that the Coast Guard is necessary to increase presence, but they themselves read through that a host of other things occurs. Like we go to Greenland, we build a bunch of bases. That's definitionally what increased military presence looks like, especially because we don't have a lot of bases in the Arctic right now. It's pretty reasonable to assume that a substantial increase would involve bases. At that point, the round boils down to who solves for indigenous peoples better. They have conceded the prereq that Milan reads out of rebuttal, which explains that they're literally just solving for a problem that they create. They take away ancestral land and food sources and then give people jobs so they can buy expensive processed foods, which ultimately is just a prerequisite to their argument, because indigenous peoples don't need white saviors to come in and give them jobs. But second, we would say that starvation triggers immediately because land usage and construction emissions occur immediately, but building the infrastructure and educational institutions that actually create this long-term solvency that they talk about takes years and years, in which people starve, and extinction of indigenous populations occurs already. On our case, they read you that the Arctic is never going to escalate and Russia's only there to do trade, which means there are no security threats in the Arctic. Why is this key? It means that when we go in with the military, it doesn't actually increase FDI, because their only warrant is that the military increases security. But if there are no threats, there's nothing that the military uniquely boosts for investment. But second, we would say that when they concede the response about permafrost on their C2, that it says that we should wait until 2050 to build infrastructure, and we should instead focus on research right now, which otherwise trades off with military presence, is key, because it means that A, it's far better for indigenous people if we wait 20 years to build this infrastructure and go in, because then the infrastructure actually lasts me long term. But B, it means that wait, what was I gonna say? Never mind, there is no B, that's time.
Taking prep. We've used 110 so far.
Connor, can you be on call? Okay. It's just gonna go down. I think our case and then your case. All right, is anybody not ready? Actually, like the order is just like it's a little messy because I'll cover like your C1, but it's just gonna be like the indigenous debate. All right. Time starts now. On our case, they only go for two responses. The first is that security exists right now, but it completely concede the Erlanger evidence out of rebuttal, which indicates that Russia wants to make the Arctic its own, putting increasing emphasis on the Arctic and building up militarization. They've not read a single evidence in summary as to why there's security existing right now. We have proven Russia will escalate. We've also proven incentives for other countries, i.e. oil and trade routes, which means militarization is inevitable. They'll trigger all their links. They concede in first crossfire that militarization's negative impacts on indigenous is not specific to the US. If we can prove that there are other countries there, the union disclose inherently us, because we have proven that we are the only risk of solvency. The second response we'll go through here is the ally argument. They've completely conceded that our other allies feel like we are not committed to the region, which is why they are building up their military capabilities right now. However, affirming means that we give them a security guarantee, meaning they can draw down. If one actor increases but draws down 10 other actors, it is definitely better on net for militarization and decreasing the total amount of troops harming indigenous people there, which is another link you can vote there on like the indigenous debate. But at that point, the second response they say is that permafrost loss means we should invest like 20 years down the line. One, we have absolutely no time frame to like invest there. Why would we wait 20 years when they're already being displaced right now? Their own evidence finds they have low food security right now. We need investment like in the status quo. We can't wait 20 years for when permafrost kicks in, because that's when the indigenous people lose all their land. We can't afford to wait like all that time. At that point, our case is completely clean. They've not touched the investment link. In summary, the Mendes evidence says that people are leaving the Arctic first, like because of like lack of employment, with 52% of people unemployed. That's why the HEW evidence says that U.S. military deployment will lead to a $21 million increase in investment for every 100 troops, because investors across the world and in their own countries see that when the U.S. military there, the area is a lot more secure. It means that they can put investment there, which solves for all the economic impacts. The Greenlee evidence finds says that investment is what indigenous communities need to stop cyclical poverty. Even if they try to bring up past examples, they're only cherry picking like two examples. We'd say on that it's still beneficial, and they conceded the internal warrants as to why this does boost. Next, let's go to their case. Oh, also like the weighing here is just really simple. They've considered uniqueness that they're already being displaced right now, which means that if there's any chance that affirming can solve, you automatically vote there, because if you negate, then you automatically trap the millions of indigenous people there in already suffering conditions. When if you affirm, you have a chance to solve. On their case, one, they say like we're going to build bases. That's new in summary, and they've dropped that. Connor said we already have 5 bases. We don't need more. You break the time incentives, we can utilize current ones, which averts cost and construction. They say we have radar on the the Devlin evidence, but a lot of our tech isn't toned for the Arctic. All of your empirical evidence is from areas we're comfortable operating in, which is why you extend the analysis here that we'll consult them and we'll cooperate with them. We don't have incentives to take away their land, because we need to cooperate with them in order to successfully operate militarily in the Arctic. That is the incentive for the U.S. specifically in this region. None of their incentives are specific to the Arctic itself. We give the only analysis on that uniqueness. Finally, the Pyrrhic is obviously not true. They conceded the most recent piece of evidence, which Hancock 23 explains, as warming causes climate change. We lose Arctic sea ice at 30% per decade, which means that they'll lose all their lands inevitably. But if investment is true and our links also take over, it means we can solve for the ecological impacts and also bring investment, which solves for all the infrastructure deterioration and means that their livelihoods are more sustainable. The only risk of solvency is us, so you affirm.
Okay, y'all good for grand?
Yeah,
Yes.
sorry.
Y'all take first question.
Okay. Did the U.S. consult and cooperate with indigenous people in the past when they built those 5 military bases that you talk about?
We didn't launch our new strategy. That
Well, okay, a couple things. One, Connor read the response that specifically in the analysis wise, that we don't build these bases near people, and also you've not read an independent impact off of these 5 bases. Plus, we say we never utilize them to their full extent, which is why we didn't have to consult, because we never launched full operations. We just
So then, what a substantial increase in military presence means is either A, we use these bases to their fullest extent, or we build new bases. You can't just say that nothing happens.
No, we do. No, our argument is that we do use these bases to their full extent, right? Military presence can come in the form of troop deployments. We say we already have 5 bases there, which is why we don't need to build more.
Yeah, okay. So then when those troops go there, they pollute more, they do more exercises, that's more oil.
No, okay. Your argument and your evidence literally says that around bases are the root cause. The infrastructure of military bases being there in the first place is what causes pollution. But our argument
But why is
relating
the
to
infrastructure bad, right?
Okay.
Because they use it to burn oil. They use it to test these weapons that leach chemicals. That's why bases are
okay, a
bad.
couple things. One, even if you like win, the US is independently bad, you're still losing on like that other countries would draw down if we affirm. But second, like our argument is specifically that we would consult in a world where we actually do military operations, which is when we substantially increase presence, right? It's not just empty bases. We're actually doing operations when we like affirm, which is why we like do the consultation there. That's aligning with our strategy. Okay, can we have a question?
Yeah, sure.
Connor, do you want to take one or?
I'm good.
Okay, let's talk about permafrost. So like, I guess like, what's the implication of this response?
Oh, two implications. First, it's terminal defense because it means that the infrastructure to like that the FDI goes into and ultimately is your internal link into poverty reduction or whatever can't be built because it just like melts. But second, it's an independent reason to vote neg because it means that now we can do the research that makes it easier and more sustainable to build infrastructure once the permafrost melts and ultimately triggers your impact.
Can I have like a quick follow-up?
Yes.
So one, is the research like solving for Indigenous right now? Like, are they like stopping displacement?
Okay, the displacement thing is totally extended through ink. It's frontline. It's actually responded to in Milan's rebuttal because you read it in case. First, that piece of evidence is talking about rural people, like talking about displacement. It's about rural people living in the Arctic, not Indigenous people specifically who have ties with.
Wait, no. I'm not just talking about like the case card. I'm also talking about like sea ice and other militarization. Like, is this research going to solve all the problems, or like, do we need to do more?
I mean, it's going to severely mitigate the problems. Obviously, we're not going to say like where there's 100% probability.
Okay, how is like research going to solve the problems?
It's adaptation, right? Like you learn how to build on these changing environments. You learn how to like, I don't know, readapt fishing, readapt road building. It's just research is necessary in order to build things in general.
Okay, give me a sec to grab water. You're voting to protect Indigenous communities. At the end of their summary, they can see that higher investment in military commitments are meant to fix deteriorating infrastructure, which loses them the round for a few reasons. First, the deteriorating infrastructure is a couple things: bases that are sinking and outdated, and tech systems like radar. That means they de facto concede we're building new bases in the aft. They also concede defensive missile systems, bases, new troop deployments are all enough to pollute and take away ancestral lands from Indigenous communities that they also need to fish and feed themselves. That also means fixing radar and whatever infrastructure that we need happens in the aft, which means we don't need Indigenous people to help guide us through regions we already have satellites spotlight score, which means we have no incentive to stop taking indigenous people's lives and land. Even if we do have incentives, the stuff we do, like putting missiles and bases and troops in peaceful indigenous land, is fundamentally antithetical to indigenous people's lives and livelihoods and culture. At that point, you have to negate, because US military policy in the Arctic has historically come at the expense of indigenous communities and increased pollution. 100% of the fish near US military bases and US missiles and US troop deployments are contaminated, and which is leading to, which is going to be the nail in the coffin with new deployments, because food insecurity is already really high. They've conceded that food is the best link into helping indigenous people, which is their own terminal impact. You vote off any risk of offensive argument. It's always better to give indigenous people the agency to feed and decide their own livelihoods themselves. That means they don't need white saviors to come in and give them jobs. Commercial companies in the defense industry always have perverse incentives. They're going to stop prioritizing indigenous people as soon as it isn't convenient for them. Prefer our solvency. They concede hospitals and stuff like that are solving the status quo by increasing entrepreneurship and the safety net, which are the best routes out of poverty. They're also losing the uniqueness debate. Other actors are solving for indigenous peoples right now, but the US military has empirically never benefited indigenous people. Don't fall for an argument with zero historical backing. On their case, they say militarization is non-unique, but they themselves concede Russia is never going to escalate and is only in the Arctic to do oil and trade, meaning that the Arctic is peaceful in the long term, not actually going into violent territory. 3 implications. First, that allies don't see any threat and don't build up, especially in the long term. Second, indigenous peoples are safe from the impacts of militarization absent the AF. Third, it's terminal defense on their FDI argument, which is their whole case, because there's no perceived increase in security for a region that already is not militarizing, is not actually going to war. So you're not actually seeing any actual increases in FDI, no increases in any of the things that they have to win a ton of steps in their link chain. Finally, permafrost function as terminal defense as well. The infrastructure needed to access poverty reduction never gets built if it's all sinking and you don't have research into permafrost. Okay.
Wait, Connor, do we have prep left?
No.
Okay.
Just you're out of prep. Okay. Cool. So order's gonna be like, it's gonna be talking about indigenous people. Everyone good? All right. Starting on our case, I don't even know at this point. All right. If we win the uniqueness debate, we win the round. The only response they have is there's other solvency, like the only solvency they say is solving now is hospitals, but they can see that their own evidence postdates by 2 years and says that they're still under food insecurity, which is why even though there might be some solvency right now, our argument is that it's clearly not enough when they're still being displaced at highly unjust rates. The Mendes evidence also does not say that they're working right now, just that it could happen, which is why our argument is that the only tangible risk of solvency is voting AF. Insofar as we are winning, that right now the indigenous people are being displaced, which means that if you vote for them, they get displaced either way. But the only way to have a risk of solving the conflict is for voting for us, which is why you end the round right there. That being said, let's go to their responses. First thing they tell you is that there's no security that can be created, but there's 2 problems of which they have fully conceded. The first thing they have conceded is that Russia will escalate and do things like oil drilling, even if it's not military presence. Escalation, like we told them they wouldn't do on their own case, it's perceptual. They still do some escalation, and we can kick them out of the region. But second, they say that they fully conceded the allies' turn, where we tell you that by we increase militarization, we create when the U.S. increases militarization, then what we see is we see the other allies back down because they feel like we already have security for them. The reason why U.S. military is bad for indigenous people doesn't just apply to the U.S., it applies to all the countries, which is why we solve on scope, because we increase ally militarization on net. That being said, the second response they have on our case is that we should wait 20 years, but they have fully conceded the risk of solvency. The 2023 evidence from Hancock tells you that right now the indigenous people are being displaced by climate change by 2040. We are the only risk of solvency in the round. That is the most recent piece of uniqueness, which is why you pull the trigger right there. But second, we would argue that now, and also the food insecurity thing, all that's happening. Third thing is that we already have technology, so we don't need to work with indigenous people. That doesn't matter. The DHS strategy says we're working with them anyways in 2023. On their case, you can classify basically everything. First, they say that they're a prereq, but no, Hancock says that they're being displaced either way. But second, on the argument about food, the definite card answers this when it tells you that we'll establish contractual relationships, so we won't do things that piss them off, which is just fully conceded. Even if one country increases military, voting AF means 10 country decreases, which is like we outweigh on scope. When you affirm, it's just a reason why you should prefer us. We're the only risk of solvency. We're winning that right now, and just people are being displaced because of climate change. The only risk of solvency is by voting AF. All right, good round, y'all.
Right.
You're on.